Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Quan Graves Cocon. Let's get into the video. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at economics. So this is typically a topic that a lot of people think of as really complicated. They think of it as boring, they think of it as nerdy, but essentially it's just how we manage money in the economy, whether that's us as private citizens spending it, whether it's government spending it, whole different things. So there's many different facets to it, so we're going to try and explore as many of those as possible in as short a time as possible in this video. So stay tuned. Now, human beings, for as long as we've been able to count, have been struggling with the mammoth task really of how to actually organise an economic system. And I really want to give a shout out to a channel that I watch in particular called Economics Explained. Definitely give them a check out. I will try and give them a link in the description. Their videos are really good, and if you want to know more details into lots of different things, I really highly recommend that channel. Right, for those of you who might occasionally watch the news and you see the GDP growth figures go up or down depending on like what's happening in the markets at that time, you might ask, okay, what is GDP? Well, GDP is just the measurement of it's just a way of us measuring the size of the economy. So GDP is calculated in a formula, and I'll try not to give the basically, long story short, it's this, right? So you got consumer spending, which is represented by C. You got investment, which is represented by I. You got government spending, which is represented by G, and then within a bracket, you've got exports minus imports. So that's X minus M. Don't know why it's M, because there's already an I with investment, whatever. So consumer spending, investment, government spending, plus whatever's left between exports and imports. So that's how we basically measure GDP. So economists will look into all those different things, and that's when they will come up with the GDP figures. They will give forecasts for what they think will happen in the next quarter, so the next 3 months, and yeah. So by looking at it throughout each of the 3 months within it, each 4 of the 3 months within a year, each quarter of the year, we can see over the course of a year how much the economy has actually grown in real terms. Right, so just to give a perspective on this, last time I checked, the UK GDP was roughly about $2 trillion, £2 trillion, which is about 2.5 trillion dollars. The US economy, in contrast, I believe last time I checked, it was something like 17 trillion. Obviously, that figure goes up with each year, so that figure may be slightly outdated. But it's a thing of that gives you a broad idea of the size of an economy. Now, GDP is not the only thing that one can look at. So, for instance, China and America's GDP are now roughly at parity. They're roughly at the same level. However, China's population, for instance, is 4 times that of the US. So we use another measurement called GDP per capita. Per capita is in Latin per, basically, I can't remember the literal translation, but it basically means like per head, yeah, like kind of per person. So if you take all the money within an economy and divide it equally amongst all the people, you would say that, right, this is 17 trillion divided by 1.4 billion Chinese people, or it's 18 trillion divided by 350 million Americans, or whatever the exact figures are right now. So, and with that, you'd get the figure of what GDP per capita is in that country. However, GDP per capita doesn't give all the story anyway, and the reason for this is something known as income inequality or wealth inequality. So, in very simple terms, if we have an example where you have one person who has made £1 million in a year, another person who's on 50,000, and a third person who's making nothing that year, then the GDP per capita for that tiny country of free people would be £350,000. As we can see, the vast majority of that wealth would be in the hands of, it would be skewed very much towards the person who's got £1 million, and wouldn't really take into consideration the person who's on £50,000 or the person who's on zero. So that, just in very, very simple terms, is a demonstration. It is obviously not as extreme as that, but that is a broad demonstration of how GDP per capita, it's not the be all and end all, and there's other things we have to take into consideration. And that's why when we're looking at it, as important as GDP per capita is, as just a rough guide, a much better measurement would be median income, right? So in that same example as before, for those of you who are good at maths, yeah, you know that the median is when you find the middle value, right? So the person who's on zero, the person who's on £1 million, the person who's on 50,000, right? So you take the median figure, so you'd say that the median for this tiny country of three would be £50,000, which isn't necessarily, it doesn't give you a really great idea of how big that economy is, because that economy that we've just posited would obviously have a GDP in total of 1,050,000, right? So to say that it's 50,000 again doesn't necessarily give all the picture. So in a way, you have to take both into consideration when actually working out how wealthy is a person in said country likely to be. And this is where we take into consideration another measurement called the Genie Coefficient, right? So very, very simply, if you had a society that had 100% equality, every single person earns exactly the same, doesn't matter whether you're a banker or whether you're a street cleaner, you're still earning the exact same. So in that kind of utopian society, what some would say, the Gini coefficient would be 0. And in a society where every single other person has no money and one person has all the wealth, then that would be an incredibly unequal society, and the Gini coefficient for that society would be 1. So it goes on a range between 0 and 1. So real life examples of the Gini coefficient. So the society at the current time, which is classed as being the most equal by the Gini coefficient, is the European country of Slovenia, which has a Gini coefficient of 0.24, right? So in that society, a lot of the wealth is more evenly distributed amongst the people. So you do have some people who are very rich, and you do have some people who are very poor, but most people are somewhere in the middle. So the gap between rich and poor is not as great. On the flip side, you have South Africa, which has a Gini coefficient of 0.63. So in that society, you have some people who are incredibly wealthy, and a large percentage of the population living in poverty. And so in that society there, most of the wealth is in the hands of relatively few people. And to give examples of that, with the US and the UK, the US has a Gini coefficient of 0.41, and the UK has a Gini coefficient of 0.35, right? So, and then also as well, when looking at different countries have higher tax rates on wealthy individuals, and so sometimes one has to look at the Gini coefficient after tax as opposed to just looking at it before tax, right? So if you're just looking at income just as a raw thing, if someone, for instance, is being taxed at some crazy rate of 60% or whatever, right? That means that a lot of their wealth that they have, we'll explain marginal tax rates and stuff like that in a bit. But if people are being taxed very heavily, then you'll find that Gini coefficient after taxes typically ends up being a lot less than it otherwise would be. So according to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, so it's basically the international organisation that like deals a lot with money. According to their studies, they found that the country with the highest GDP per capita is Luxembourg, the tiny European country of Luxembourg, which is essentially a tax haven, where the GDP per capita is $113,000, right? On the flip side, you have South Sudan, which has, is one of the newest countries on earth, and very, very poor. Has lots of different issues that they're trying to deal with at the moment. But they have a GDP per capita of just $275, not $1,275, right? So that is, they're making less. The average person in that country is making less than $1 a day. And on the flip side, the average GDP per capita for the UK is somewhere in the ballpark of about $35,000 rather, and the US is roughly $41,000. The IMF and most monetary terms will evaluate things in dollars. So for all the people getting triggered out there because I'm not putting it in pound terms, just do the conversion rates yourselves. The dollar is the international marker of how we measure currency for various different political reasons, but we're not going to get into that in this video. So as we've really touched on, it's a thing of within any sort of economic system, one of the central debates is always about what should the role of government be, because human beings, obviously, like left to their own devices, there will be inequality, and some people will naturally accrue more money, and some people will have less. Right? It's not as simple as saying the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That's largely a myth if one looks into the statistics. Typically, it's a thing where all levels of income steadily rise over time. Sometimes the rich might get richer at a faster rate than the poor. Sometimes the poor's wages might stagnate, so they might stay the same for a long time. They might dip a little bit, but broadly speaking, the economy grows, and people at all different levels of the income scale do rise with that over time. But it's a thing of people question about what the role of government ought to be, because should we have a more hands-off government which kind of just lets the marketplace do its own thing, or should we have more state intervention? So as we mentioned earlier about taxing more to reduce income inequality, to spend money on different things, or is too much interference in the market counterproductive? Does government intervention end up leading to inefficiencies? Does it end up leading to more poverty? So these are some of the things we're going to look into in this video. Now, there are essentially four strains of economic thoughts, and many of these we will go into more depth in future videos when we talk about political theory, because economics, philosophy, and politics are very neatly intertwined. That's why in many elite universities they have PPE, which is politics, philosophy, and economics. And many elite people who in government studied these kind of courses, right? I didn't. I was able to study politics, but I wasn't able to get the grade for that. But I still have a decent understanding of these things. But so the main different strands of economic thought are Marxist, corporatist, basically social democratic. One could also call it Keynesianism, and then you have what's known as free market / laissez-faire economics, right? So laissez-faire is French. It basically means like you're kind of free to do whatever you want, basically. Not exactly what you want, but kind of so on one end of the scale you have Marxism, where the government owns the means of production, they control the factories, they control everything. Like everyone works for the government, and all industry or everything is owned by the government. And in that system, there is no private property. Everything is owned by the state. Meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum, with laissez-faire economics, you basically have a system where people are, the market's not really interfered with too much, and people can basically do whatever they like within the confines of the law. So within Marxism, for instance, if we look at examples like the Soviet Union, like Cuba today, etc., what we end up seeing with, so the state controlling lots of different things is good in some ways, in the sense that it ensures that people are covered for the basic necessities in life, such as healthcare and education, etc. On the other hand, it's a thing of everything, even down to the extent of whether you're allowed to drive a car, or even to the extent of, in Cuba, if you have a toaster, the government will allow you to have a toaster only if they can work out that it will be a net benefit to everyone on your street. So everyone within your community, if you have a toaster, can at any point be like, oh, sorry mate, I need to use the toaster, right? So that's the kind of, so if you have on that extreme where, and in places like Cuba, while they do have some of the best doctors in the world, it's this thing where, and one of the highest proportions of doctors in terms of population anywhere in the world, it is also a fact that many doctors have to moonlight on the side. So they have to, a doctor can in Cuba make more money being a what do you call those people? The people who like stand at the doors and hold the doors open for you. I can't remember the name. Not valet. Kind of a valet, basically, right? Doorman? Yeah, doorman. There we go. My brain just got. So you can make more money being a doorman in Cuba than you can as a doctor. You can make more money being a taxi driver, driving tourists around, than you can as a doctor. So while there's good things in systems, there's also some negative things, right? So this is some of the things we're going to explore, some of the other theories. Right, so the next one we're going to look at is corporatism. So corporatism is, so the way to think about it is, this is mainly typified in more authoritarian countries, such as like fascist countries, Nazi Germany, all these kind of places, but also places that were a bit less extreme than that, but still, so in a corporatist society, it's a thing where private businesses are technically allowed to run, but it's a thing of how they operate and what they have to produce is dictated by the government. So the government goes, right, you're not selling cars anymore, you're making tanks for us, right? For instance. So there's a thing of there's a veneer of private property ownership, but in reality the state does still control everything. So in that system, it's quite difficult to think of good things for that. People used to say, for instance, the common thing people used to say with like in fascist Italy, people would be like, well, at least the train runs on time. So yeah, there's not much to say about that. I mean, it's a lot of those systems will try their best to focus on like getting rid of employment. Getting rid of unemployment. And so they'll put lots of like money into sending unemployed people to the army or to weapons factory, etc., right? So yeah, I'm trying not to let my political views come through with this, but it's quite difficult to make some pluses for this. So yeah, but anyway, definitely look more into corporatism, and hopefully you can find some more positive things potentially. Right, so the next one we're going to talk about is Keynesianism, right? So this is typically the kind of so Keynesianism and laissez-faire economics, which is what we'll get into in a second, both of those systems are what you typically see within liberal democratic states, right? So we've moved away from the authoritarian like dictatorship and stuff. Now we're moving into we live in a free society, right? So within Keynesianism, there will be some industries that will be nationalised, yeah, such as railways, etc., etc. So certain like utilities and certain industries that are seen as key to the national interest or national well-being of its citizens. These things will typically be nationalised. So if they're nationalised, it means that they're run by the government, supposedly on the behalf of the citizenry. And under Keynesianism is the belief of, as we mentioned earlier, about having progressive tax rates. So taxing wealthier people at a higher rate than people at lower rate. That doesn't mean that if there's a 60% tax that they're taking 60% of your wealth. It means 60% of your wealth above a certain rate. So that's essentially what marginal tax rates is. We'll get into that at another point as well when we're talking. There'll be a video about taxation, so we'll go more into depth on that then. But typically with Keynesianism, you will have high tax and high spend government. So yeah, the government will tax a lot, but then they will use that revenue to spend money on education, on healthcare, etc., etc. And Keynesianism, named after John Maynard Keynes, famous economist, and the belief was that it doesn't really matter too much if you end up running into what's known as a budget deficit. So if the government spends more than it takes in from taxation, that's okay. In the same way as if you were going to buy a house, you'd have to take out a loan for the mortgage on that. So a little bit of debt is fine as kind of in the Keynesian eyes, and it doesn't really matter too much about balancing the budget as such. So that essentially summarizes Keynesianism. And finally, we're going to look at free market economics or laissez-faire economics. So this is more typified with so if one can think about it within a liberal democratic sense, the more liberal / left side of the spectrum on economics tend to lean toward Keynesianism, whereas typically the more right-wing people on economics, so not talking about social issues, just on economics, typically these people will lean more towards laissez-faire economics, right? So with that, it's a thing of the government pretty much does it enforces property rights, and that's pretty much all it kind of does, and there's obviously a whole range of debates about how small the state should be, how little the government should tax and spend. Typically, these people will have a lot of emphasis on keeping taxes very low, keeping spending very low, and keeping deficits either at a minimum or non-existent. They want the government each year to spend less than what they come in from tax because they don't want national debt to grow. So they're known as fiscal conservatives. So they try to be very frugal with the amount of money that it kind of is, right? So examples in the world of a Keynesian system would be something like what they have in many of the Scandinavian countries. So in Sweden, in Denmark, these kind of places, they have more of a social democratic or Keynesian perspective on economics. And somewhere that has, places that have more laissez-faire approaches to it would be somewhere like Singapore, places like Hong Kong, and Switzerland, and many other places around the world, right? And even within, if you think about the US versus the UK, within the UK we have the NHS, we have welfare state, we have lots of different components that lean us more towards the Keynesian side of things, whereas within America, most most health coverage is in the private sector, and so there's an example of how America leans more towards having a kind of laissez-faire system, right? So when we think about the difference between Keynesianism and free market economics, yeah, this is really well typified by the debates that Keynes had. Yeah, so Keynes, British economist, very prominent around the late 20s and early 30s, and you had Friedrich Hayek, who is an Austrian economist, yeah, from the same period, and both of these two men came from completely different schools of thought in terms of how the government should respond to the Great Depression, right? So for those who don't know, there's a big stock market crash in 1929, just as there was in 2008, just as there is likely to be in 2020, given how volatile everything is with the current crisis. And throughout your lifetime, there will be many recessions, right? And each time there is a recession, there's always the constant debate about how the government should respond at a time of crisis like that, right? So Keynes was saying that the way to get out the Great Depression, yeah, was for the government to increase its spending, right? Because remember, one of the components of GDP is government spending. So the idea is increase government spending, then that steadies the market, that gives people jobs, right? It boosts confidence, because for Keynes, he believed in everyone having he believed in markets being run by what he called animal spirits. So when there was a bull market, that's when the economy is doing well. When there was a bear market, that's when things were that's when the economy was doing badly, right? So he said that in a bear market, right, if you increase government spending, you'll boost confidence in all these things, you'll increase investment, you'll increase consumer spending, the entire economy, in theory, should be boosted up. Now what Hayek was saying is that this is the wrong way of approaching this for two main reasons. Yeah, there's many other reasons, but the two main reasons. First of all, for the government to get money, they have to first take it from somewhere else, right? So if they are spending this extra money, it means that they either have to raise tax, or they have to do what's called inflation, where the central banks will print lots of different, print a lot of money, and they'll spend it and stuff. Yeah, but the thing is, sometimes that often leads to inflation, and this is something we're going to get into in one of the later videos. Actually, we can probably do it in the next video. Actually, talking about the debt crisis, right? Which we are currently facing. So, if you have inflation, that can end up, eroding everyone's savings, but it can also erode people's debts, right? So it's a thing of, it's really good for people who have debts, but it's not so good for the people who have been saving during that time. So it's so Hayek was saying that whatever the government did, it at some point would end up having a negative cost for the general public, right? So even if in the short term you might see a boost in things, it would cause long-term problems. And he said that the best way to get out of a recession was to let the markets fix themselves, right? He believed that price signals were a good indicator of that's how the market kind of decides things, essentially. Yeah, so what we pay for prices for things when we buy them, all the labor that's gone into it, all the transportation costs, etc., all those different things, right? And if the price for it is too high, then consumers will be less likely to spend. If it's low, then people will be more likely to spend, right? But if the government comes in and essentially distorts those price signals, makes it either cheaper or more expensive than they otherwise should be, then it ends up leading to inefficiencies, and the market doesn't fully know what the actual price of said product should be, and then you can end up causing a lot more problems. So if you just leave the market alone and just let things sort itself out, then the market, you might have a few years of recession, but eventually the market will correct itself. And in the meantime, what people ought to be doing is save and invest, because he focused more on long-term thinking rather than short-term thinking, right? And if you really want to know, like, well, in a much cooler and more exciting way than I can really give credit, than I can really do justice to, right? I would really highly recommend watching the Keynes versus Hayek rap videos. This is from about 10 years ago. They're absolutely brilliant. Like, you don't have to be an economics nerd to really love them, and it's entertaining, and it will really allow you to get a good grasp of the thing. So I'll put a link in the description, right? So finally, I just want to summarize with a bit of a reflection on it. So the economy, as we can see, has many different levels to it, many different ways of measuring it and stuff, right? And it's a thing of get two economists in a room and ask them about something, and you'll very quickly see that there's very little agreement between them, right? But that doesn't mean that we can't learn from other people. As we mentioned in the philosophy discussion where we spoke about Hegel, right? A Hegelian worldview of this would be to look at things and be like, right, what good things are there from the Marxist view of economics, from the corporatist view of economics, from the Keynesian view of economics, and from the laissez-faire free markets view on economics, right? And there's inherent problems with all of them. So, for instance, if one was talking about the issues of inequality, the people on the free market side of it typically ignore inequality and kind of say it doesn't really matter. But there are tangible reasons why having a slightly more equal society is beneficial in other ways, right? People might disagree on what those means ought to be in order to achieve those ends, but there still is room for a lot of debate, and to get the right economic system, it will take the amalgamation of many different ideas, taking the good from the bad and trying not to be too rigid and ideological with our approaches to things. Again, that doesn't mean abandon our principles, but it's a thing of one should be open towards different stances on economics than your own, and think, right, what valuable things could we learn from what this person's saying, and what things do I have to question about my own views on economics for that. So hopefully this has given you guys a brief and hopefully entertaining view on economics, which is often seen as a very kind of nerdy subject that people, rich people in suits talk about. But economics is for everyone. It is everyone. We are the marketplace. We are the economy. There's no such thing as choosing between the people or the economy. At the end of the day, the two are the same, right? You can't have an economy without people, and unless you want to go back to the days of hunter-gathering, you can't have people without an economy. So that being said, like and subscribe, comment on the things. Definitely check out some of the links in the description for the different videos. I highly recommend these channels and these videos. So in the next video, we are going to be talking about the looming debt crisis we're currently in. So I'll try and make it less depressing than it sounds. But anyway, thank you and goodbye.